Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep, a king so large he had to be moved through his own palace by mechanical contraption. A man who married 6 women, executed 2 of them, divorced 2 more, and somehow convinced himself each time that God was on his side. Henry VIII is perhaps the most recognisable monarch in all of human history. And yet the real story, the full story, is stranger, darker, and far more human than any portrait or textbook has ever managed to capture. Tonight we trace the complete journey of the man who broke a church, remade a nation, and never once admitted he was wrong. The boy who was never meant to be king. England in the 1480s was a kingdom still trembling from its own recent history. The Wars of the Roses, that long and brutal contest between the houses of Lancaster and York, had carved the country open for 3 decades, staining noble families into extinction, reshuffling loyalties with every season, and leaving the throne itself feeling like an object someone had simply forgotten to lock down. By the time Henry Tudor claimed the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485, England was exhausted. It wanted stability more than it wanted glory. It wanted a king who would simply stay on the throne long enough for the furniture to stop moving. Henry VII, the first of the Tudor dynasty, was precisely that kind of king. He was careful, methodical, and deeply suspicious of extravagance. He counted his coins with the focus of a man who understood that money was power and power was survival. He was not beloved in the way that later monarchs would be celebrated, but he was effective. He built an administration. He rebuilt the treasury. He married strategically, taking Elizabeth of York as his queen and knitting the 2 warring houses together in one household. It was, as diplomatic marriages go, a reasonably successful arrangement. They appear to have genuinely liked each other, which was not always a given in those circumstances. Into this careful, watchful court, children arrived. Arthur was born first in 1486, the crown prince, the heir, the golden boy upon whom all Tudor hopes were loaded. He was named deliberately after the legendary British king, because Henry VII understood the power of symbolism as well as he understood the power of money. Arthur was to be the embodiment of a new age. He was educated accordingly, trained in languages and statecraft and the careful art of seeming both approachable and untouchable at the same time. Henry was born 4 years later, in 1491, the second son. And here is something important to hold on to as this story unfolds. Henry was not raised to be king, he was raised to be the spare. In a dynasty as fragile as the Tudors, having a second son was valuable, but he was valuable primarily as insurance. If Arthur lived and thrived and produced heirs of his own, Henry would likely have entered the church, because that was one of the few respectable career paths available to royal younger sons who would never inherit the crown. Think about what that means for a moment. The man who would eventually break with Rome, declare himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and dissolve centuries of monastic tradition, was originally being groomed to become a Catholic clergyman. History occasionally has a sense of humour. Henry's early childhood was spent largely in the shadow of his older brother. Arthur received the grander education, the more formal preparation, the heavier schedule of diplomatic grooming. Henry was educated too, and educated well. He was by all accounts a naturally gifted student. He learned Latin, French, and Spanish. He studied music and theology. He developed a real and lasting passion for literature, for theological debate, for the kind of earnest intellectual discussion that his era took seriously in a way we might find surprising. By his teenage years, Henry could hold his own in conversation with the finest minds in England, and he was proud of that. He was also, from a very young age, extraordinarily physical. He was tall for his era, reportedly standing at around 6 feet 2, which in the 1500s was not merely tall but almost conspicuously so. He was athletic, enthusiastic about jousting and wrestling and archery and the hunt. He had the energy of someone who had not yet been told what he could not do. And he had charm. The kind of instinctive social magnetism that some people are simply born with, the ability to make whoever was in the room feel as though they were the most important person present. That gift would serve him enormously in the years ahead. But before Henry had any opportunity to deploy these gifts on a wider stage, history intervened in the cruelest possible way. Arthur, the crown prince, the carefully prepared heir to the Tudor dynasty, died in 1502. He was only 15 years old. Arthur had married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, just months before. The match had been a diplomatic triumph for Henry VII, binding England to one of the most powerful ruling families in Europe. The young couple had been sent to Ludlow Castle in Wales, where Arthur was nominally serving as Prince of Wales. Within weeks of their arrival, both Arthur and Catherine fell seriously ill, likely with sweating sickness, a mysterious and terrifying disease that swept through Tudor England with casual brutality. Arthur did not recover. His death sent shockwaves through the court and through Henry VII himself, who reportedly wept openly, an unusual display for a man not known for emotional extravagance. Elizabeth of York, Henry's mother, is said to have comforted her husband and then fallen ill herself not long afterward. She died the following year in 1503. Within the space of about 12 months, Henry VII lost his heir and his wife, and his second son, 10 years old, suddenly found himself the most important person in England. The transformation of Henry from royal spare to royal heir happened quickly and changed nearly everything about his circumstances. He was pulled out of the relatively relaxed educational environment in which he had been operating and inserted into something far more tightly controlled. His father, already a man inclined towards suspicion and caution, became intensely protective of his only surviving son. Henry was restricted. He could not go out freely. He could not joust without supervision. He was kept close, watched, guarded against every conceivable risk. It was, by most accounts, a deeply constrained existence for a boy of enormous physical energy and equally enormous intellectual ambition. Some historians have suggested that this period of enforced containment had lasting consequences for Henry's personality. A child who is naturally energetic and socially gifted, suddenly confined and surveilled and treated as a precious object rather than a person, might well develop a complicated relationship with restriction. He might develop a deep and genuine hatred of being told what he could not do. He might grow into a man who, once freed from those constraints, would exercise his freedom with a kind of ferocious thoroughness. That is, at minimum, an interesting theory. It is probably not a complete explanation, but it is worth keeping in mind. Henry VII spent his final years in declining health, still managing his kingdom, still counting his coins, still maintaining the careful, pragmatic administration that had kept the Tudors on the throne for 2 decades. He negotiated endlessly over what to do with Catherine of Aragon, who had been left in England after Arthur's death in a state of considerable diplomatic and financial uncertainty. Neither England nor Spain could quite agree on what should happen to her. At one point, Henry VII himself reportedly considered marrying her, which suggests either remarkable pragmatism or a somewhat relaxed approach to the concept of family. Nothing came of it. When Henry VII died in 1509, he left behind a treasury that was, by Tudor standards, impressively full. He left behind an administration that functioned. He left behind a dynasty that had survived its vulnerable early years. And he left behind his surviving son, now 17 years old and newly crowned King Henry VIII of England. Possessed of a physical presence, an intellectual confidence, and a passionate appetite for life that had been compressed and contained for too long. The constraints were gone, the stage was his, and he had absolutely no intention of being cautious about any of it. The Golden Prince, Henry's early reign. If you had visited the court of Henry VIII in the first years of his reign, you would have encountered something that felt almost intoxicating by comparison with what had come before. Henry VII's court had been competent and orderly and quite relentlessly dull, run by a king who regarded unnecessary spending with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for root canal work. Henry VIII's court was different in nearly every possible way. The new king was 17 when he came to the throne. He was physically magnificent by the standards of the age. Tall, broad-shouldered, with reddish gold hair and the kind of complexion that painters like to work with. He wore his clothes as though they had been created specifically to be worn by him, which in fairness, they had been. He moved through rooms with the ease of someone who had always known they were the most important person in them. Not with arrogance exactly, but with an absolute certainty that was, in itself, a kind of performance. People noticed him. People were meant to notice him. The court erupted into a social life that England had not seen for decades. Banquets were organised on a scale that made the accountants nervous. Music was played constantly, and Henry himself was a genuine and accomplished musician who played the lute, the organ, and the virginals with real skill. He composed songs, some of which have survived. Whether Greensleeves was genuinely his composition is a matter of some historical debate, but the fact that the question has been asked at all tells you something about the reputation he cultivated. He was a man of culture as well as a man of physical power, and he wanted both halves of that identity to be clearly visible. He jousted with enthusiasm and considerable skill, entering tournaments sometimes in disguise, as though the assembled court would somehow fail to recognize the tallest and most physically imposing man in the arena. The disguises were not especially convincing, but everyone played along because that was what you did. You played along with the king's games and you made sure he won, because the alternative was awkward for everyone. Alongside all of this energy and display, Henry moved quickly to establish his governing priorities. One of his first acts was to have two of his father's most unpopular ministers, Empson and Dudley, arrested and eventually executed. These were men who had been responsible for enforcing Henry VII's financial policies, particularly his aggressive approach to extracting money from the nobility through legal mechanisms that felt, to many, more like extortion than governance. By removing them, Henry signalled clearly that his reign would be different. He was positioning himself as the antidote to his father's tight-fisted administration, the king who would spend and celebrate and reward. The nobility loved him for it, at least initially. He also married, and married quickly. Within weeks of his coronation, Henry wed Catherine of Aragon, his late brother's widow. She was 23, 6 years his senior, dark-eyed and composed and intelligent. The marriage had been discussed and negotiated and complicated for years during his father's reign, and Henry seems to have resolved the theological questions it raised about the propriety of marrying a brother's widow with relative ease. He obtained a papal dispensation. He convinced himself that the marriage was perfectly legitimate. He also seems to have genuinely liked her, which was, as always in royal marriages, a pleasant bonus rather than a requirement. Catherine was, by most accounts, an impressive woman. She had spent 7 years in England after Arthur's death in a situation of considerable difficulty, short of money, uncertain of her status, navigating the complicated waters of Tudor court politics without the full backing of either her father's court or her adopted country. She had emerged from that experience with her dignity intact and her intelligence sharpened. She spoke Latin fluently, which meant she and Henry could have actual intellectual conversations, something he prized enormously. She was devout, organised, and possessed of a natural dignity that commanded respect. In those early years, Henry VIII appeared to be everything that England had been hoping for. He was young and healthy and demonstrably capable of governing. He was educated and cultured. He was physically imposing in ways that mattered for a medieval monarch. Because a king who looked like a king was a king whose authority felt self-evident. He was also, in these first years, genuinely affectionate toward Catherine, speaking warmly of her to foreign ambassadors, showing her public respect, writing her letters that suggested actual tenderness rather than mere diplomatic courtesy. It is worth pausing on this because the later history of Henry and Catherine is so overwhelming that it can be easy to forget that there was a period, nearly 2 decades, when their marriage functioned and mattered, and when they appeared to genuinely value each other. History sometimes gets so interested in how things end that it forgets how they began. Henry had a close circle of advisors and companions in those early years. Thomas More, the brilliant humanist lawyer, was one of the intellectual lights of the court, a man whose mind Henry genuinely admired and whose company he sought. The friendship between them was real, even if it would later come to a catastrophic and irreversible end. There were other companions, young men who shared the king's love of sport and hunting, and the kind of energetic male sociability that Tudor court culture organised itself around. But the figure who gradually emerged as the most influential single presence in Henry's early reign was Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was the son of a butcher from Ipswich, which in the rigorously hierarchical world of Tudor England was not a promising beginning for someone with large ambitions. But Wolsey was extraordinary. He was brilliant, tireless, and possessed of an administrative capacity that was genuinely rare. He understood how power worked, how to accumulate it and exercise it, and make oneself indispensable to those who held it. He rose rapidly through ecclesiastical ranks and into royal service, and by the 2nd decade of Henry's reign he was effectively running the country on the king's behalf. This suited Henry, at least for a time. Henry VIII in his early reign was not uninterested in governance, but he was also very interested in hunting and jousting and music and feasting, and the idea of having someone else manage the tedious administrative machinery of the kingdom while he got on with being magnificent was genuinely appealing. Wolsey managed. Henry reigned. The arrangement worked, up to a point. Henry's early foreign policy was driven by a desire for military glory that was partly personal vanity and partly genuine strategic thinking. The great powers of Europe, France, and the Holy Roman Empire and Spain were locked in complex patterns of alliance and competition, and England sat at the edge of this game, wanting to matter more than its resources perhaps strictly justified. Henry wanted a war with France, partly because English kings had claimed territory in France for centuries, and partly because defeating France was simply what ambitious English kings did. He got his war. In 1513, English forces invaded France and won a modest engagement at the Battle of the Spurs, so named because the French cavalry fled so quickly that the battle was decided more by horsemanship than by combat. Henry was delighted. He celebrated enormously. Meanwhile, back in England, Catherine of Aragon acted as regent in Henry's absence and oversaw the defence of the realm against a Scottish invasion, which ended decisively at the Battle of Flodden in September 1513. The Scottish King James IV was killed. The Scottish army was broken. Catherine wrote to Henry with evident satisfaction, sending him a piece of the dead Scottish king's coat as a trophy. This was, even by the standards of the era, a somewhat assertive way to conduct diplomatic correspondence. But it tells you something about Catherine. She was not a passive figure. She was a capable ruler who understood exactly what she was doing. These were, in many ways, the golden years, a young king brimming with energy and confidence, a capable and respected queen, a court that buzzed with intellectual life and cultural ambition, an administration that, for all of Wolsey's gathering power, functioned. England was not the most powerful kingdom in Europe, but it was not negligible either. It had a king who looked and acted the part. It had stability. And then, slowly, the complications began. The issue was succession. Henry and Catherine needed a son. Not merely wanted one, needed one. In the urgent political sense that a male heir was considered essential to dynastic stability, in an age when female rule was regarded with deep skepticism by most of the European political establishment. Catherine was pregnant multiple times. The pregnancies did not go well. There were stillbirths and miscarriages and infants who survived only days or weeks. In 1516, a daughter, Mary, was born and survived, healthy and bright, and clearly her father's child. Henry is recorded as being pleased. He reportedly said that sons would follow. They did not follow. By the early 1520s, it was becoming increasingly apparent that Catherine, now in her late 30s, was unlikely to produce a surviving male heir, and Henry, who had grown up in a dynasty that owed its very existence to a victory at Bosworth Field against a childless king, understood what the absence of a male heir could mean. It meant vulnerability. It meant the kind of instability that could undo everything his father had built. It also meant, though perhaps this came slightly later, that Henry was going to have to make some very difficult decisions, or convince himself that they were not actually difficult at all. He was becoming rather good at that. Catherine of Aragon, the queen who would not bend. To understand what happened between Henry and Catherine, it helps to understand who Catherine was before she became famous primarily for what was done to her. Because Catherine of Aragon was not simply a wronged wife. She was a woman of extraordinary stubbornness, genuine intellectual capacity, and a theological conviction so deep and so absolute that she chose humiliation, poverty, and effective imprisonment over the compromise that might have saved her comfort if not her dignity. She had been born in 1485, the youngest surviving daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, two of the most formidable rulers of the age. Her parents had unified Spain, financed Columbus's voyages to the Americas, and driven the Moors from their last stronghold in Granada. They were not people who bent easily, and their daughter had inherited that quality in full measure. Catherine had been raised for queenship from childhood. She was educated in languages and theology and the management of courts. She had been told since she was small that her destiny was to be a Queen of England, and she had organised her entire sense of self around that identity. When Arthur died and she found herself stranded in England in circumstances that were both degrading and genuinely difficult, she did not collapse. She adapted. She endured. She waited. And when Henry VIII finally married her in 1509, she seems to have genuinely believed that the waiting had been worthwhile, that the plan had ultimately worked, that she was where she was meant to be. She was a good queen to him for nearly 20 years. She ran his household. She managed his correspondence during his absences. She bore his children, even though most of them did not survive. She maintained the dignity of the court with a natural authority that commanded respect from foreign ambassadors and English nobles alike. Henry's feelings toward her changed gradually, not overnight. There were other women along the way. Henry was not a faithful husband, a fact that Catherine appears to have accepted with the pragmatic resignation of a queen who understood that royal faithfulness was not a given. He had a prolonged relationship with Mary Boleyn, and before that with Elizabeth Blount, who gave him a son in 1519. The son, Henry Fitzroy, was illegitimate, but he was healthy and male, and Henry acknowledged him with evident pride, giving him titles and honours that suggested the king had not entirely given up on the idea of a male heir outside of wedlock solving his dynastic problem. It did not ultimately solve anything. The moment that changed everything came sometime around 1525 or 1526, when Henry's attention shifted decisively to Mary Boleyn's younger sister Anne. But we will come to Anne in the next chapter because she deserves her own. What matters for understanding Catherine is how she responded to Henry's demand for an annulment. Because the word divorce, which is the word usually used in popular history, is technically not quite right. What Henry wanted, what he argued for, what he spent years pursuing through legal and theological channels, was an annulment. He wanted the church to declare that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the first place. His argument rested on a passage in the book of Leviticus, which stated that a man should not take his brother's wife. Henry became convinced, or convinced himself, that his inability to produce a surviving male heir was divine punishment for having entered a prohibited marriage. This argument required accepting several things simultaneously. It required accepting that the papal dispensation that had allowed the marriage in the first place had been improperly granted. It required accepting that Catherine's first marriage to Arthur had been a real and consummated marriage, rather than the brief arrangement it had been. And it required a somewhat selective reading of the relevant biblical texts, because other passages suggested quite different things. None of this was straightforwardly simple, theologically speaking. But Henry had decided, and once Henry had decided something, finding reasons to support the decision was much easier than questioning it. Catherine's response to all of this was categorical. She refused. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had not been consummated, making it, in ecclesiastical law, essentially no marriage at all, which meant there was no impediment to her marriage with Henry. She insisted that the Pope's dispensation had been properly granted and remained valid. She insisted that she was Henry's lawful wife and the Queen of England, and that no court on earth had the authority to say otherwise. She made these arguments clearly, repeatedly, and with impressive theological precision. She also wrote directly to her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who happened to be the most powerful ruler in Europe, asking him to use his influence to prevent the annulment from going forward. This was, diplomatically speaking, not ideal for Henry. Charles V controlled much of Italy, which meant he controlled considerable influence over the papacy. Pope Clement VII found himself in the genuinely uncomfortable position of being asked by the King of England to annul a marriage while simultaneously being extremely dependent on the political goodwill of the emperor who was that queen's nephew. Clement, who was by temperament a cautious and indecisive man, responded to this situation in the way cautious and indecisive men often do. He stalled. He referred the matter to committees. He made noises of sympathy without taking action. He stalled some more. This went on for years. 7 years, in fact. During those years, Catherine's position at court became increasingly difficult. She was separated from Henry. She was moved from household to household, her staff reduced, her status degraded. She was denied access to her daughter Mary. She was pressured repeatedly by Henry's agents and by various churchmen and nobles who hoped to curry favour with the king to accept a lesser title, to step aside gracefully, to acknowledge that the marriage was over. She refused every time, absolutely and completely. She would not bend. She signed her letters, Queen Catherine, until the very end of her life, because she believed that is what she was, and she was not willing to say otherwise simply because it would have made things easier for everyone around her. There is something genuinely impressive about this, and it is worth acknowledging regardless of how one feels about the theological questions involved. Catherine was a woman in her 40s, in deteriorating health, separated from her daughter, stripped of her household, denied access to the courts that might have helped her, and subjected to years of psychological pressure from one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, and she held her position with complete consistency. She did not waver, she did not compromise, she did not pretend. Henry found this maddening. He had expected her to give way. He had expected perhaps a graceful retirement, a dignified withdrawal. What he got instead was a woman who looked him in the eye and told him that he was wrong and that God would judge him for it, and who showed every sign of being entirely sincere about both claims. The Spanish ambassador, who observed all of this with considerable interest, reported that Catherine was the most popular person in England, that ordinary people in London cheered for her in the streets, that women in particular seemed to have felt her situation deeply and personally. Whether this tells us more about Catherine or about the situation of women in general in Tudor England is an interesting question. Perhaps both. What it tells us about Henry is perhaps most revealing of all. He was not accustomed to being refused. He was not accustomed to having his decisions questioned with such sustained and public persistence. And he was not a man who responded to opposition by softening. He was a man who, when faced with resistance, intensified. The more firmly Catherine refused, the more firmly Henry pushed, and the more firmly Henry pushed, the more the situation escalated into something that was no longer merely a marital dispute, but a constitutional crisis that would reshape English history entirely. The king's great matter: divorce, defiance, and the church. The thing people sometimes forget about Henry VIII and his pursuit of an annulment is how long it took. 7 years. 7 years of negotiations, arguments, legal proceedings, theological debates, diplomatic manoeuvring, and an increasingly frustrated king who had been told no more times than he was used to, and was running out of patience in ways that were becoming visible to everyone around him. This period, which contemporaries called the King's Great Matter, was not simply a domestic dispute that accidentally became a constitutional crisis. It was a crisis that grew because Henry VIII made it grow, because every avenue that seemed to offer resolution turned out to be blocked, and because the man who might have resolved it, the Pope, was in a position where resolving it was politically impossible for him. Thomas Wolsey, who had been Henry's great minister for 15 years and who had considerable experience managing complicated ecclesiastical affairs, was tasked with resolving the king's great matter and found himself unable to do so. He had built his career on the assumption that his access to both royal and papal favour made him indispensable to both parties. The annulment crisis exposed the limits of that position. When Henry needed the Pope to cooperate and the Pope would not cooperate, Wolsey could not manufacture cooperation that was not there. His fall came in 1529. He was stripped of the Great Seal, removed from his position as Lord Chancellor, and charged with praemunire, a legal concept relating to the improper use of foreign authority in England, which was applied to him with a certain creative flexibility. He was preparing to face trial when he died in 1530, reportedly telling those around him that if he had served God as diligently as he had served the king, God would not have given him over in his grey hairs, which is, when you think about it, a remarkably honest assessment of his own priorities. Wolsey's fall left a vacancy not just in the administration, but in the question of how England would proceed, and into that question stepped a variety of people with a variety of answers, the most important of whom were Thomas Cranmer, a theologian who would become Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cromwell, a lawyer and administrator of formidable, practical intelligence who would become Henry's chief minister, and a woman named Anne Boleyn, whose influence on events was far greater than any formal position she held. But let us stay with the constitutional story for a moment, because it is genuinely remarkable. The solution that gradually emerged was this: if the Pope would not grant Henry an annulment, perhaps the Pope's authority over England could simply be removed. Perhaps England did not need to ask Rome for permission to manage its own ecclesiastical affairs. Perhaps, in fact, the idea that the Bishop of Rome had any special authority over the English Church was not theologically sound and had never been. Perhaps it was an historical usurpation, a gradual accumulation of power that had no legitimate foundation. This argument, once it began to be made openly, gained momentum with surprising speed, because it was not entirely new. There had always been an undercurrent of resentment in England about papal interference, about the drain of money to Rome, about the way ecclesiastical courts operated outside the normal jurisdiction of the English legal system. Henry's situation gave those resentments a focus and a powerful patron. The Parliament that sat from 1529 to 1536, known to historians as the Reformation Parliament, passed a series of statutes that progressively dismantled the legal and financial connection between the English Church and Rome. Appeals to Rome were forbidden. Annats, the payments made to Rome upon appointment of bishops, were curtailed. The submission of the clergy to royal authority was enforced. Each step was presented not as a revolution but as a restoration, not as breaking with tradition but as reclaiming what had been England's by right. What Henry was doing was extraordinary. He was not the first European monarch to quarrel with the Pope, but he was doing something qualitatively different from most of those quarrels. He was not merely defying papal authority in a specific matter, and then eventually reconciling. He was dismantling the institutional structure through which that authority operated. He was step by step making it legally and practically impossible for Rome to exercise jurisdiction over England. The philosophical justification for all of this had several elements. One was the idea of the imperial crown, the argument that England was an empire in the old sense, a self-sufficient political unit that owed no legal allegiance to any foreign authority, including Rome. Another was the growing Protestant theology flowing in from Germany and Switzerland, which questioned the scriptural basis for papal primacy, and argued that the Church had deviated from its proper foundations. Henry was not himself a Protestant in any clean theological sense. He rejected much of Lutheran doctrine, including the denial of transubstantiation, and he went to his grave asserting certain traditional Catholic beliefs. But he used Protestant arguments opportunistically, as intellectual cover for a restructuring that was primarily political. By 1533, events had moved to their logical conclusion. Thomas Cranmer had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. The Act in Restraint of Appeals had been passed, blocking Catherine from appealing to Rome. Cranmer convened a court in England and pronounced Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. Henry had already secretly married Anne Boleyn, who was by this point visibly pregnant. The Pope responded by excommunicating Henry. Henry, for his part, responded to excommunication the way most people respond to receiving an invoice for something they have already decided not to pay. He noted its arrival and moved on. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy was passed. The King of England was declared the supreme head of the Church of England. The break with Rome was legally and institutionally complete. What this meant in practice was still being worked out, and would continue to be worked out for the rest of Henry's reign, and well beyond. But the structural reality was stark. England had left the Roman Catholic Church, not theologically in the Protestant sense that Henry's children Edward and Elizabeth would later pursue, but institutionally. The Pope's authority in England was gone. The King's authority over the Church was absolute, and anyone who questioned that arrangement did so at serious personal risk. Thomas More, who had once been Henry's friend and Lord Chancellor, refused to take the oath of supremacy. He did not argue publicly. He simply refused to swear. He offered no explanation. His silence was the most powerful statement available to him. Henry had him tried for treason and executed in July 1535. John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, refused as well. He was executed alongside More. Henry had broken a church, remade a constitutional order, and killed men he had once called friends. The great matter had been resolved. Whether the resolution had improved things was a question that would be debated for the rest of history. Anne Boleyn. The woman who changed everything. There is a version of Anne Boleyn that is very easy to tell. The ambitious schemer who seduced a king and manipulated him into breaking with Rome for her own advancement, only to overplay her hand and end up on the scaffold. That version is tidy and dramatic and has been retold in countless novels and films and television series. It is also, most historians would argue, significantly incomplete. Anne Boleyn was born sometime around 1501, though the exact date is uncertain, the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious and capable diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, from one of the most aristocratic families in England. She had spent years in France, first at the court of Margaret of Austria, and then at the court of the French Queen, and she arrived back in England in the early 1520s with a cultural sophistication that was genuinely unusual for an English noblewoman of her era. She was not, by contemporary standards, conventionally beautiful. She was dark, slender, with long dark hair and large dark eyes, and a kind of vivid animation that people noticed even in accounts written by those who disliked her intensely. She had a sixth fingernail on one hand, which her enemies later used as evidence of witchcraft, with the creativity that political character assassination tends to inspire. She was sharp-tongued, opinionated, and not particularly interested in hiding either of those qualities. These were not, in 16th century England, unambiguously desirable traits in a woman, which is perhaps one reason why the accounts of her are so varied and so contradictory. Henry noticed her with an intensity that suggests his attraction was genuine rather than calculated. Sometime around 1525 or 1526, he had already been involved with her sister Mary. He now began to pursue Anne with the kind of single-minded focus he brought to everything that genuinely interested him. And Anne did something that most women in her position did not do. She did not sleep with him. This requires some contextualization. The court of Henry VIII was not a place of Victorian sexual restraint. Extramarital affairs among the aristocracy were common and understood as such. Henry had already demonstrated his willingness to take mistresses. What Anne appears to have calculated, or perhaps genuinely believed, was that being the king's mistress was not a sufficient goal. She had watched her sister occupy that position and gain relatively little from it. Anne wanted more. Anne wanted to be queen. Whether this was pure ambition, or whether she genuinely fell in love with Henry, or whether it was some complicated mixture of both, is impossible to know from this distance. What is clear is that she refused to sleep with him, maintained that refusal over several years with impressive consistency, and that Henry's frustration with this refusal appears to have intensified his desire rather than diminishing it. He wrote her letters. 17 of them survive in French, which is slightly remarkable given that Henry usually had his correspondence handled by secretaries. The letters are urgent, plaintive, sometimes almost wheedling in their need. He calls her his darling. He says he cannot bear to be without her. He promises eternal devotion. They are genuinely love letters, which complicates the straightforward narrative of Anne as mere instrument of Henry's political convenience. By 1527, Henry had begun pursuing the annulment from Catherine, and Anne's presence in his life had become openly acknowledged. She was given rooms at court. She was treated with a status that made her position clear even before any formal change had occurred. Those who supported Henry's annulment cultivated her favour. Those who opposed it knew she was an obstacle. The years of waiting were apparently difficult for both of them. Henry's letters become progressively more frustrated. Anne was not meek. She argued with him. She complained. She accused him of preferring Catherine's company to hers on at least one occasion. She pushed for faster progress on the annulment. She had her own views on theology, leaning in a Protestant direction in ways that influenced Henry's intellectual circle. She had her own views on politics. She was not simply waiting decorously in the wings while the men sorted out her future. By 1533, the situation had finally moved. Henry and Anne had apparently begun sleeping together around the end of 1532, because by December of that year she was pregnant. They married secretly in January 1533, before the official annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine had been declared. By June, Anne had been crowned queen in a ceremony of considerable magnificence. By September she had given birth. The child was a girl. They named her Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment was genuine and visible. He had wanted a son. He had upended his marriage, broken with Rome, executed old friends, and reorganised the constitutional structure of England in pursuit of a male heir. And the woman he had done all of this for had given him a daughter. He recovered his composure. He continued to hope for a son from the marriage. But the relationship between Henry and Anne began to show strains. The strains were probably inevitable. Anne had been most powerful when she was unattainable, when Henry's desire was frustrated and she was the woman he wanted above all others. Once she was his wife and queen, once the chase was over and the prize was won, the dynamic changed. Henry was a man who functioned well in pursuit, and less well in the ordinary maintenance of a relationship, and Anne was not a woman designed for quiet domesticity. She was combative, politically engaged, vocal in her opinions, and apparently unwilling to pretend otherwise. She also had real enemies. The conservative faction at court, the people who still supported Catherine and the old religious settlement, had reason to hate her. The people who were losing power in the new religious dispensation had reason to fear her. Even among those who had supported the break with Rome, Anne's influence was not universally welcomed. Thomas Cromwell, who had become Henry's chief minister, was increasingly operating in directions that diverged from Anne's own ambitions. There were further pregnancies. One ended in a stillbirth in 1534. Another in January 1536 ended in a miscarriage. The baby, it was said, appeared to be male. Henry's response to this loss was not consolation. It was anger. He told Anne, according to some accounts, that she would get no more sons from him. By this point, Henry's eye had already moved to another woman at court. Her name was Jane Seymour. Anne Boleyn had less than a year left to live. Her fall, when it came, was organised and rapid and carried out with a brutality that shocked even people who had grown accustomed to the political violence of Henry's court. In May 1536, she was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. She was charged with adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn. She was also charged with plotting the king's death. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. The evidence was thin to the point of transparency. The men accused alongside her were tried, convicted, and executed. Anne was tried separately before a court that included her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and convicted of all charges. She was executed on the 19th of May, 1536, on Tower Green within the Tower of London. She died with composure, making a final speech that was careful not to condemn Henry, but also not to confess to crimes she had not committed. She reportedly said, "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." Whether she was sincere or being carefully strategic in a final performance designed to protect her daughter's future is something historians still debate. She was 35, perhaps, or possibly younger. She had been queen for approximately 1,000 days. The day after her execution, Henry VIII became betrothed to Jane Seymour, the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. We have already traced the political and legal mechanics of the break with Rome in the previous chapter, but the story of what that break actually meant for the people of England, what it looked like in practice rather than in statute, is worth exploring on its own terms, because the English Reformation, as it developed under Henry VIII, was not a clean theological revolution. It was something considerably messier and more interesting than that. Henry VIII was not a Protestant. This point cannot be stressed enough because it is the point that confuses most people when they first encounter it. He believed in the Mass. He believed in purgatory. He believed in clerical celibacy, at least in principle, if not always in practice. He had written a defence of the 7 sacraments against Luther's challenge early in his reign, and Pope Leo X had rewarded him with the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, a title that British monarchs still carry today, which is one of history's better ironies given what happened subsequently. Henry executed Protestants, burning them for heresy, even as he simultaneously dismantled the institutional structure of the Catholic Church in England. He managed to offend both sides with impressive efficiency. What Henry created was something new and not entirely coherent. A church that was Catholic in doctrine but not in allegiance, that rejected the Pope's authority but retained the bishops, that preserved the form of the Mass but placed the English crown at the apex of its organisational structure. The theological content of English Christianity would shift dramatically under his successors, Edward VI pulling it in a Protestant direction and Mary the Woman pulling it back toward Rome. But the institutional structure that Henry created, the Church of England with a monarch at its head, proved surprisingly durable. For ordinary English people, the experience of the Reformation in Henry's reign was a mixture of bewildering, disorienting, and practically significant. The most practically significant change for most people was the dissolution of the monasteries, which we will address in a later chapter. But there were other changes too. Images were removed from churches in some places. Pilgrimage sites were closed. The bones of saints, which had been objects of veneration and sources of significant income for the churches that housed them, were in some cases destroyed or dispersed. Thomas Becket's shrine at Canterbury, one of the most famous pilgrimage destinations in all of Christendom, was dismantled on Henry's orders in 1538, and the considerable wealth it contained was transferred to the crown. Becket himself was posthumously tried for treason, which is, one has to admit, a creative approach to dealing with a saint who died 350 years before you were born. The vernacular Bible became increasingly available during this period. William Tyndale's translation had been suppressed, and Tyndale himself executed for heresy in 1536, which was an interesting statement about Henry's approach to reform. But by 1539, the Great Bible, the first authorised English Bible, was being distributed to churches across the country. Henry wanted the Bible in English available to literate people, but he was becoming increasingly nervous about what the less educated might do with it, and in 1543 he passed an act restricting who was permitted to read it. This is, in short, a somewhat complicated religious landscape. Henry wanted the papacy gone and royal supremacy established. He wanted the monasteries dissolved and their wealth transferred. He wanted a Bible that people could read in their own language, at least to some extent. He did not want Protestant theology. He did not want the Mass abolished. He did not want clerical marriage, and he burned people who advocated too enthusiastically for these things. The result was an English church that was institutionally reformed but doctrinally uncertain, a church that was neither fully Catholic nor straightforwardly Protestant, that housed within it people of genuinely incompatible theological views, held together primarily by the authority of a king, who was more interested in the political dimensions of religious settlement than in the theological ones. It was not, in other words, a model of religious clarity. But it was perhaps a model of a kind of English pragmatism, a willingness to find an institutional arrangement that worked even if it could not be described with perfect doctrinal precision. The people who suffered most visibly in this period were those who could not accommodate the uncertainty. Thomas More, John Fisher, the monks who refused to surrender their monasteries, the Pilgrims of Grace who rose in rebellion in the north of England in 1536. These were people whose faith was specific enough and sincere enough that they could not simply go along with a settlement whose theological content changed depending on who had the king's ear at any given moment. Henry dealt with opposition to his religious settlement with the same approach he brought to most opposition. He removed it. By execution where necessary, by imprisonment where that would serve, by exile when he felt generous. The number of people executed for reasons connected to the religious changes of Henry's reign runs into the hundreds, possibly higher. Martyrs on both sides of the emerging Protestant Catholic divide. People executed for too much attachment to Rome, and people executed for too much enthusiasm for reform, occasionally in the same year and sometimes by the same government. The Church of England that emerged from all of this was imperfect and contested and permanently marked by the manner of its creation. It remains so in certain ways, but it also became one of the defining institutions of English life, a church deeply embedded in the culture and landscape of a country that still argues about it constantly, which is perhaps the most English thing of all. The fall of Anne Boleyn. The fall of Anne Boleyn is one of the most forensically examined events in Tudor history, and the closer you examine it, the stranger it becomes, because the straightforward version of events, that Henry had grown tired of Anne, found a new woman he preferred, and arranged for Anne to be removed, while not entirely wrong, misses several layers of complexity that make the full picture considerably more disturbing. Let's begin with what we know. By the early months of 1536, Henry's relationship with Anne was in serious difficulty. The miscarriage of what appeared to be a male child in January 1536 had been a devastating blow. Henry's response to it, his fury rather than his consolation, suggests that the marriage had reached a point where goodwill between the parties had essentially run out. He was seen increasingly in the company of Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, with an attentiveness that was not subtle. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister since Wolsey's fall, had originally been something of an ally to Anne, or at least not an opponent. But by 1536 their relationship had deteriorated. Anne had her own foreign policy preferences, which diverged from Cromwell's. She was pushing for closer ties with France. Cromwell preferred alignment with the Holy Roman Empire. She had ideas about how the wealth from the dissolved monasteries should be spent. Cromwell had different ideas. She was increasingly vocal in her opposition to his approach, and she had the king's ear, at least theoretically. What Cromwell appears to have done, and this is the interpretation most historians find most convincing, is to have organised the downfall of Anne Boleyn in a way that addressed his political problems while simultaneously giving Henry what he wanted, which was an escape route from the marriage. He moved quickly, gathering what evidence he could and supplementing it where necessary with inference, extraction, and possibly fabrication. Within weeks, a case had been assembled. The charges were extraordinary. Anne was accused of adultery with 5 men: Henry Norris, who was one of the king's closest attendants, Francis Weston, William Brereton, a court musician named Mark Smeaton, and her own brother, George Boleyn. The charge of incest in particular seemed designed to shock, to place the accused so far outside the bounds of acceptable behaviour that no one would question the verdict. Smeaton, the musician, confessed. He was probably tortured, though the sources are ambiguous about this. His confession was the only actual confession obtained. All of the other accused men denied the charges entirely. George Boleyn's wife, Jane Parker, appears to have provided damaging testimony against both her husband and Anne, for reasons that are debated by historians, but which may have included a genuinely dysfunctional marriage and possibly her own desire to survive the crisis. The trials were brief and the outcomes were predetermined. The 5 men were tried, convicted, and executed. Anne was tried separately before a court of peers that included her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who presided with an apparent lack of emotional difficulty that was either admirable professionalism or extraordinary callousness, possibly both. She was found guilty and condemned to death. There were people at the time, and there are historians now, who believed at least some of the charges might have been true. It is not impossible. Courts were places of proximity and opportunity, and Anne was a woman whose social ease and physical expressiveness could be interpreted in various ways by various people, but the evidence as examined suggests that the charges were overwhelmingly likely to be false, that the trial was a legal performance rather than a genuine inquiry into guilt, and that the outcome was decided before the proceedings began. Henry seems to have believed the charges, or perhaps more precisely, he seems to have needed to believe them. Accepting that Anne was guilty made what he was doing morally legible to himself. If she had betrayed him, then he was the wronged party, the victim rather than the perpetrator, the man seeking justice rather than the man eliminating an inconvenient wife. This psychological maneuver, the recasting of himself as the victim in situations where he was actually the agent of destruction, was one Henry would employ more than once. On the day of Anne's execution, her marriage to Henry was declared null and void by Archbishop Cranmer, on grounds relating to Henry's earlier relationship with Anne's sister Mary. This meant that technically, and Henry was very interested in the technicalities, Anne died not as queen but as a private person. It also meant, in a stroke of legal tidiness that should not be allowed to obscure what was actually happening, that their daughter Elizabeth was now illegitimate. Anne was executed on the 19th of May, 1536, as noted in the previous chapter. She had been in the Tower for 19 days. Henry wore yellow on the day she died, which contemporaries interpreted in various ways. Some said it was mourning livery in France, others took it as a celebration. Henry's own explanation, if he gave one, has not survived. The day after Anne's death, Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour. They married 10 days later. One does not want to rush to judgment, but one does want to note that 10 days is rather brisk. Jane Seymour, the quiet wife and the longed-for son, after the turbulence of Catherine of Aragon's enduring resistance and Anne Boleyn's sharp intelligence and vocal personality, Jane Seymour presents a striking contrast. She is in many ways the most difficult of Henry's wives to fully see, partly because she was genuinely quieter than the others, and partly because the image of her was carefully cultivated after her death into something almost idealized. Jane was born around 1508, the daughter of Sir John Seymour and his wife Marjorie Wentworth. The Seymours were a reasonably well-connected English gentry family without the European connections of Catherine of Aragon or the courtly sophistication of Anne Boleyn. Jane had been at court as a lady-in-waiting, first to Catherine and then to Anne, which meant she had watched both of the previous queens navigate their relationships with Henry from a position of close proximity. Whatever conclusion she drew from that observation, she kept largely to herself. Henry's pursuit of Jane during the final months of Anne's life was conducted with a certain brazenness. Jane was coached, it appears, partly by members of her own family, who understood exactly what was happening and had the good sense to manage it carefully. When Henry sent her a gift of money and a letter, she returned both unopened, saying, virtuously, that she had no greater treasure than her honour. This was the right answer, and the people advising her knew it was the right answer, because they had watched what happened to Mary Boleyn, and they had a clearer view of what Henry actually valued than Henry's own letters perhaps suggested. Jane was described by the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuys, who had been Catherine of Aragon's champion at court, as of middle height, of mediocre beauty, so fair that one would call her rather pale. He also noted that she was not very intelligent. This is possibly an accurate assessment, or possibly the view of a man accustomed to Catherine of Aragon's formidable intellect, applying an unfavourable comparison. It is also possible that Jane was simply quiet in ways that were mistaken for limited intelligence by people accustomed to more vocal women. What Jane appears to have had was a talent for reflecting back to Henry what he wanted to see, a capacity for the kind of steady, uncomplicated affection that he seems to have found genuinely restful after the exhausting intensity of his relationship with Anne. She is said to have interceded with Henry on behalf of Princess Mary, his daughter from Catherine of Aragon, and to have contributed to the reconciliation between Henry and Mary that occurred in 1536. If this is true, it suggests a degree of emotional intelligence and strategic awareness that sits oddly with the portrait of her as simply mild. Henry's behaviour toward Jane was also different from his behaviour toward Catherine and Anne. He did not write her agitated letters. He did not pursue her across the country. He married her within days of Anne's execution, and seems to have settled into the marriage with something approaching relief. He called her his true wife, which was a pointed statement given the history, and appears to have maintained a genuine, if not intensely passionate, affection for her. Jane became pregnant in 1537. The pregnancy proceeded normally, and on the 12th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son. The boy was named Edward, and he was healthy. Henry's response was one of undisguised joy. He had waited for this for nearly 30 years. He had broken his marriage, broken his church, executed old friends and loyal servants, burned and hanged his way through theological dissent, all in pursuit of a legitimate male heir who might secure the Tudor dynasty against the fragility he had seen tear his father's world apart. And now, finally at 56 years old, he had his son. The celebrations were enormous. Bonfires were lit across London. Church bells rang for days. Henry wrote to foreign ambassadors with obvious pride. He described Edward as a prince whom the whole realm had so long desired. He seems to have been, for a brief period, genuinely and uncomplicated happy. The happiness was brief. 12 days after Edward's birth, Jane Seymour was dead. She died, most likely of puerperal fever, an infection following childbirth that was common and devastating in an era before antibiotics. She was approximately 29 years old. Henry's grief appears to have been genuine and lasting. He wore black for 3 months, which was an unusually extended period of official mourning. He reportedly described Jane as the one he loved most, though one might note that this comment was made at a moment when she was dead and therefore incapable of contradicting him. He had portraits made of her, and he sat with her image for years afterward. When he died, more than 9 years after Jane, he was buried beside her at Windsor Castle, as he had apparently requested. Jane Seymour occupies a peculiar place in the story of Henry's wives. She was not powerful in the way Catherine was, not intellectually combustible in the way Anne was, not strategic in the way the later wives would prove to be, but she gave Henry what he had spent decades seeking, and she died before he could grow tired of her, which may have been the secret of her hold on his memory. She became, in death, the perfect wife, because death prevented her from becoming anything else. Thomas Cromwell and the dissolution of the monasteries. If Henry VIII was the architect of the English Reformation in its political dimensions, Thomas Cromwell was the builder who turned the architectural drawings into something that could actually stand. He was one of the most important figures of 16th century England, and also one of the most controversial, a man whose administrative genius remade an institution, and whose eventual fall was as dramatic as any in Tudor history. Cromwell was born around 1485, the son of a Putney blacksmith and clothworker. This origin was even more modest than Wolsey's, and the Tudor court was not a place where modest origins were easily forgiven or forgotten. His enemies used his background against him repeatedly, sneering at the blacksmith's son who had made himself a minister of England. Cromwell seems to have absorbed this snobbery with the patient attention of a man who understood that in politics, results matter more than birth, and who was very good at producing results. He had spent years abroad in his youth, working in Italy and the Netherlands, learning languages and commerce and the complex machinery of European business. He had worked for Wolsey before shifting his allegiance to the king after Wolsey's fall with the pragmatic smoothness of a man who understood which way the current was running. By the early 1530s he was in Henry's service, and by the mid-1530s he was, effectively, the engine of reform. Cromwell's administrative vision was far-reaching. He oversaw the extension of royal authority into every corner of the kingdom, developing a bureaucratic machinery that made Tudor government more systematic and more powerful than it had been before. He drafted legislation, managed parliament, organised the machinery of propaganda that supported the break with Rome, and supervised the network of officials who carried Henry's authority into the localities. He was, in short, extraordinarily busy, but the project for which he is perhaps best remembered is the dissolution of the monasteries. The monasteries of medieval England were not merely places of prayer, they were major landowners, landlords to thousands of tenants, centres of education and charity and medical care, repositories of manuscripts and art, and centuries of accumulated wealth. There were hundreds of them, ranging from great institutions like Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire to small houses with a handful of monks or nuns. Together they controlled something like a quarter of all English agricultural land. The arguments for dissolution were various. Some were genuinely reformist, pointing to genuine corruption and laxity in certain houses, to monks who had abandoned the spiritual life for comfortable self-management. Some were theological, arguing that the practice of monasticism had no clear biblical foundation, and that the wealth locked in these institutions should be released for more productive purposes. Some were simply financial. Henry's government needed money, and the monasteries had it. Cromwell organised the survey that preceded the dissolution, sending teams of inspectors across the country to examine monastic houses and report on their condition. The reports that came back were, unsurprisingly given the purpose they were serving, heavily weighted toward finding problems. Stories of dissolute monks and corrupt abbots, and shamefully exploitative relics circulated through the reports and thence into the public record. Some of these stories were true, some were exaggerated, some were invented. The distinction was not, from the government's perspective, especially important. The dissolution proceeded in stages. The smaller monasteries were dissolved first. Beginning in 1536, their assets transferred to the crown. The larger and more prestigious houses followed over the next 4 years, through a combination of pressure, persuasion, and outright coercion. Some abbots resisted. A few were executed, including the abbot of Glastonbury, Richard Whiting, who was hanged, drawn, and quartered in 1539. Most, presented with the alternative, eventually surrendered. The northern rebellion, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, was largely driven by opposition to the dissolution. Tens of thousands of people in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and the surrounding regions rose in protest. Motivated by a mixture of genuine religious devotion to the monasteries, economic anxiety about what their closure would mean for tenant farmers and the poor who depended on monastic charity, and straightforward resentment of the new men who were remaking England from the centre. The Pilgrimage of Grace was one of the most serious challenges to Henry's authority during his entire reign. For a time, the rebels outnumbered royal forces in the north. Henry negotiated, promised to consider their grievances, and waited. When a second, smaller rising occurred in early 1537, he had the justification he needed. The rebel leaders were arrested and executed, including Robert Aske, the lawyer who had been the pilgrimage's most articulate spokesman, who was hanged in chains from Clifford's Tower in York. The dissolution of the monasteries was complete by 1540. The crown had gained land and assets of staggering value. Most of this wealth did not stay with the crown for long. Henry was perpetually short of money, and he sold or granted much of the former monastic land to the nobility and gentry with remarkable speed. The people who bought this land had every incentive to support the Reformation going forward, because if it was reversed, they might have to give the land back. Cromwell had created a class of people with a material stake in Protestant England, which was perhaps his most durable political achievement. The human cost of the dissolution is harder to quantify. Thousands of monks and nuns lost their vocations. Many received pensions that allowed them to live, others did not. The charitable and educational functions of the monasteries were not immediately replaced. The poor who had relied on monastic almsgiving found themselves without it. The great libraries that had accumulated in monastic houses were dispersed, many manuscripts destroyed or scattered. Some of the finest architecture in England was stripped for building material or simply abandoned to ruin. Cromwell's own end came in 1540, organised with the same ruthless efficiency that he had brought to organising the ends of others. He had miscalculated in the matter of Anne of Cleves, as we shall see in the next chapter, and his enemies at court, particularly the conservative noble faction led by the Duke of Norfolk and Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, had been waiting for an opportunity. Henry turned on him with the suddenness that characterised his treatment of men who had ceased to be useful. Cromwell was attainted for treason without even the formality of a trial, and executed on Tower Hill in July 1540. He went to the scaffold saying that he died in the traditional faith of the Church, which was possibly strategic and possibly sincere. He asked those present to pray for him. He died, as people usually did, more or less alone with whatever he believed. Henry later told his council that he had been badly advised in the matter of Cromwell's execution, that it had been a mistake, that he had lost the most faithful servant he had ever had. Whether this represented genuine regret or simply a recognition that no one around him now was quite as competent is an interesting question. Henry's capacity for retrospective sadness about people he had destroyed was, by this point in his reign, fairly well established. Anne of Cleves, the diplomatic disaster. The story of Henry's fourth wife is one of the more darkly comic episodes in Tudor history, which is saying something for a period not generally short of dark comedy. Anne of Cleves was a German princess, the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, and her marriage to Henry in January 1540 was arranged for diplomatic reasons that seemed entirely sound at the time and became rapidly irrelevant shortly afterward, in the way that diplomatic reasons for doing things sometimes do when the human beings involved fail to cooperate with the logic of the arrangement. The diplomatic context matters, so it is worth spending a moment with it. By the late 1530s, Henry's religious settlement had left England in an uncomfortable international position. The break with Rome had alienated Catholic Europe in ways that were not merely symbolic. France and the Holy Roman Empire, the two great continental powers, were both Catholic and periodically on sufficiently good terms with each other to make the possibility of a joint Catholic crusade against heretical England a genuine strategic concern rather than a paranoid fantasy. England had broken from the Universal Church, executed a former papal chancellor, dissolved its monasteries, and declared its king the supreme head of its own national church. From the perspective of Catholic Europe, this was not a minor disagreement about administrative procedure. Thomas Cromwell's solution to this diplomatic isolation was to seek Protestant allies in Germany, where the Reformation had created a patchwork of princes and territories, sympathetic to religious reform, and therefore interested in friendship with an England that had made similar moves, however idiosyncratically. The most obvious candidate for alliance was the Duchy of Cleves, which occupied a strategically significant position in northwestern Germany, and whose ruler was sympathetic to religious reform without being straightforwardly Lutheran, a distinction that mattered because Henry had his own complicated feelings about Lutheranism and was not looking for an alliance that came with theological implications he had not approved in advance. A marriage between Henry and the Duke of Cleves' sister Anne would cement the alliance and give England a Protestant partner on the continent. It was, as diplomatic solutions go, a reasonable plan. Cromwell was not wrong to pursue it. The problem, and there is always a problem, was that Henry was 50 years old and increasingly unwell, and very much inclined to be particular about the women he married, and he wanted some assurance about what Anne of Cleves actually looked like before he committed to the arrangement. He had opinions about women's appearances. He had expressed those opinions across several decades and several marriages with considerable force. He was not prepared to marry a stranger purely on the basis of diplomatic necessity, without at least some visual evidence that the stranger in question would not actively displease him. He sent his court painter, Hans Holbein, to Cleves to paint her portrait. Holbein was, by any assessment, one of the finest portrait painters of the 16th century, and he painted Anne honestly by most accounts that have examined the question. The portrait shows a fair woman with regular features, a composed and dignified bearing, and the kind of expression that suggests intelligence held carefully in reserve. She looks pleasant, she looks presentable, she looks like someone a reasonable man might agree to marry. Henry, viewing the portrait, appears to have been reasonably satisfied. He agreed to the marriage. The diplomatic machinery moved forward. Anne arrived in England in late December 1539, landing on the Kent coast and making her way toward London for the formal reception that had been planned. And here is where things began to go wrong, in a manner that is either deeply human or deeply farcical, depending on how charitable you are feeling toward the principles involved. Henry, in what the Tudor court probably should have recognised as a terrible idea, but apparently did not feel empowered to say so out loud, decided to surprise Anne at Rochester before the formal reception could take place. He arrived in disguise, presenting himself as a messenger bearing gifts from the king, and waited for Anne to be charmed by his spontaneous romanticism. This was something of a habit with him. The approach had a precedent. The lady who had been successfully charmed by this particular routine was Anne Boleyn, who had played the game of royal courtship with extraordinary skill and who had understood, perhaps better than anyone in the history of Tudor matrimony, exactly what Henry needed from a woman in any given moment and how to provide it. That had been many years ago. Several wives had come and gone since then. Anne of Cleves had not been briefed on any of this. She had not been told that the King of England had a fondness for arriving incognito and expecting women to perform delighted recognition of a man they had never met. She appears to have been watching a bull-baiting entertainment from the window of her lodgings when he arrived, which suggests that her attention was reasonably well occupied already. She received the supposed messenger politely. She was pleasant and composed. She treated him, entirely reasonably, like the stranger he had just spent considerable effort pretending to be. She did not recognize him. She did not swoon. The thunderstruck delight he had presumably been expecting failed entirely to materialize. Henry retreated. He reported to his advisers with what we can only imagine was a very particular quality of displeasure that she was nothing as fair as she had been represented to him. He is credited with describing her as a Flanders mare, though historians have debated whether this phrase was genuinely his or a later addition to the story. One of those phrases that attaches itself to a situation because it captures the feeling of it so precisely that people begin to assume it must be authentic. Whether or not he said exactly those words, the sentiment behind them appears to have been entirely genuine. He asked his council whether he had to go through with the marriage. His council, who had collectively spent the better part of a decade watching what happened to people who delivered unwelcome news to Henry VIII, and who had presumably formed views on the subject, told him that he did indeed have to go through with the marriage. The diplomatic arrangements were in place. The alliance was needed. The alternative was explaining to the Duke of Cleves why his sister was being sent home before the wedding had taken place, and that conversation had its own set of unpleasant consequences. The wedding took place in January 1540. Henry's behaviour on the morning of the ceremony gives a reasonably clear picture of his emotional state. He reportedly told Cromwell, who had organised the entire arrangement, and who therefore bore responsibility for every aspect of its failure to produce the outcome Henry had wanted, that he liked her not. He also offered a more physical complaint about Anne's appearance, describing characteristics that suggested to him she was not a virgin, which is the kind of comment that reveals a great deal simultaneously about Henry's state of mind, his sense of appropriate conversation with his chief minister, and the degree to which he was searching for reasons to object that extended beyond mere aesthetic disappointment. The marriage was never consummated. Henry told his physicians this with considerable specificity, and they believed him, because the alternative to believing Henry VIII when he told you something about himself was explaining to Henry VIII that you found his account unconvincing, which was not a professional position anyone in his medical household was eager to occupy. Cromwell, who had staked his diplomatic credibility on this alliance, and who was watching the entire enterprise collapse in real time from a distance of very few feet, must have been experiencing a quality of anxiety that is not easily put into words. Henry spent 6 months married to Anne of Cleves. She was, by every account that does not originate with Henry himself, a perfectly agreeable and sensible woman. She liked to play cards, she enjoyed music, she was cheerful and good-humoured, and managed the considerable awkwardness of her situation with a composure that, given the circumstances, deserves genuine respect. She simply was not someone Henry found attractive, and in Henry's world, in the world of a man who had dismantled the religious settlement of his entire kingdom in pursuit of a woman he desired, that was the only consideration that ultimately carried any weight. By July 1540, the marriage had been dissolved by annulment. The grounds involved a prior contract in Cleves and the straightforward non-consummation of the marriage. Anne agreed to the annulment with a pragmatic readiness that contrasts rather favourably with the behaviour of most of the other principals in the story. She was given a generous settlement, several English estates, a comfortable annual income, and a household appropriate to her status. She remained in England, outlived Henry by a full decade, and reportedly found the whole arrangement entirely satisfactory. The phrase attributed to her that she had never had it so good may or may not be precisely accurate, but it captures something real about the outcome from her perspective. She had arrived in England as a diplomatic bargaining chip, been found wanting by a king who had expected a different experience, and ended up with estates and income and freedom, and none of the dangers that came with actually being married to Henry VIII. In the ledger of Tudor marriages, this counts as something close to success. Cromwell, who had arranged the entire episode, did not share in that success. His fall came within months of the marriage, organised by his enemies at court and enabled by a king who needed someone to blame for an embarrassment he was not prepared to accept responsibility for himself. He was executed in July 1540. Henry, meanwhile, had already turned his attention to a young woman at court whose name was Catherine Howard, and the story was about to become considerably less comic. Catherine Howard, youth, recklessness, and the scaffold. Catherine Howard was perhaps 19 years old when she became Henry VIII's fifth wife in July 1540. Henry was 49, obese, often in pain from the leg ulcer that had been tormenting him for years, and apparently persuaded that he had found in Catherine a kind of youthful vitality that might restore something of the man he had been. He called her his rose without a thorn. He gave her generous gifts. He seemed, to those who observed him, genuinely besotted in the way that middle-aged men with power and resources can become besotted with very young women, which is to say, completely and somewhat pathetically. Catherine was the niece of Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, the most powerful conservative nobleman in England, and her candidacy for the king's attention was promoted by Norfolk and the conservative religious faction at court, partly as a strategic counter to the Protestant-leaning reformers who had benefited from Anne Boleyn's influence. She was young, vivacious, reportedly beautiful, and she'd been educated in the Duchess of Norfolk's household at Horsham in Sussex, which is where the complications of her past had their origins. The Duchess of Norfolk's household was a large, somewhat loosely supervised establishment with dormitories where the young women slept communally and apparently not always alone. Catherine, sometime around the age of 13 or 14, had become involved with Henry Manox, a music teacher who was paid to teach her the virginals and who had taken the arrangement further than the curriculum strictly required. This relationship had been terminated, and Catherine had subsequently become involved with a young man named Francis Derham, a member of the household, with whom she appears to have had a genuinely sexual relationship over an extended period. These were the kinds of facts that needed to stay buried if Catherine was going to be presented to the King of England as a suitable wife. They did not stay buried. Henry appears to have been aware of none of this when he married Catherine. He was certainly not aware that once she was queen, Catherine had allowed Francis Derham to secure a position in her household, which was either reckless naivety or a degree of boldness that is genuinely difficult to comprehend given her circumstances, and she had also, more perilously, developed a relationship with a young courtier named Thomas Culpeper, which appears to have involved secret meetings arranged by her lady-in-waiting Jane Boleyn, the widow of George Boleyn. Whether Catherine's relationship with Culpeper was consummated is debated by historians. The letters that survive are incriminating in tone but ambiguous in detail. What is not ambiguous is that Catherine was meeting privately with a young man who was not her husband while she was married to the king, which, given what had happened to the woman who'd preceded her in Henry's bed, requires either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary foolishness, and possibly both simultaneously. The matter came to the attention of Archbishop Cranmer in November 1541, during the royal progress that Henry and Catherine had made through the north of England. Someone, the exact person is not entirely clear, passed Cranmer information about Catherine's premarital history. Cranmer, who was not a man naturally disposed to confrontation with Henry, but who understood the danger of not acting on what he knew, passed the information to the king in a letter he left for Henry to find rather than delivering personally, which was a sensible approach to delivering bad news to Tudor monarchs. Henry's initial response was reported as disbelief. He reportedly wept. He seems to have genuinely been shocked, which tells us something about the degree to which his emotional investment in Catherine had been real, however ill-advised. He quickly moved from disbelief to fury, which was a more characteristic response. The investigation that followed was thorough and brutal. Manox, Derham and Culpeper were all arrested and questioned. Derham and Culpeper were executed in December 1541, Culpeper by beheading, and Derham by the full horror of being hanged, drawn and quartered, a distinction that may reflect the difference in their social status and their perceived degree of guilt. Catherine herself was interrogated repeatedly. She was not, it must be said, especially well served by those around her. She was young and frightened, and apparently did not fully understand what was happening or how serious her situation was until it was too late to have been strategically useful. She reportedly broke down during interrogation, alternating between confession and retraction in ways that suggested genuine confusion rather than calculated strategy. She was attainted for treason by an Act of Parliament in February 1542, which avoided the necessity of a formal trial but produced the same outcome. She was executed on the Tower Green on February 13th, 1542. She was probably 19 or 20 years old. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who had arranged the meetings between Catherine and Culpeper, was executed on the same day. She had reportedly lost her sanity during imprisonment, and an Act of Parliament had to be passed specifically allowing for the execution of an insane person, which gives some sense of how the rule of law functioned in Henry's England when it was inconvenient. Catherine Howard's story is one of the most difficult in the whole catalogue of Henry's wives, partly because of her age, and partly because the circumstances of her life before she came to Henry's notice were shaped by adults who failed in their responsibilities to protect her. Her situation in the Duchess's household, her relationships with Manox and Derham, these were not straightforwardly the adventures of a free agent. She was a girl in an institution where older men had access to her and where the oversight that should have protected her was absent. That the consequences of those early experiences ultimately fell on her rather than on the people who had been responsible for her is one of the more dispiriting aspects of her story. Henry, following Catherine's execution, seems to have retreated into something that observers described as depression or sorrow. He ate more. He became more difficult. He remained without a wife for more than a year, which was, by his own historical standards, an extended period of reflection. Catherine Parr, the wife who survived. Catherine Parr had the distinction, not entirely enviable, of being Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. She was 30 years old when she married him in July 1543, twice widowed already, educated, Protestant in her sympathies, and possessed of a practical intelligence about the situation she was entering that serves as a useful counterpoint to the tragic naivety of Catherine Howard, who had preceded her and whose fate was still fresh in the memory of everyone at court. Where Catherine Howard had been young and reckless and apparently unaware of the full weight of what she had stepped into, Catherine Parr arrived with her eyes open, her assessment of the situation clear, and a considered strategy for surviving it already in place. She is in many ways the most purely competent of Henry's wives, and competence in the world of the Tudor court was not a small thing to be. She was not, by most accounts, beautiful in the conventional sense that Henry had previously prioritised. The early wives and the later ones had been chosen partly for their looks, partly for diplomatic value, partly for the particular quality of attention they generated in a man who was accustomed to being the most noticed person in any room, and who wanted the woman beside him to be worth noticing. Catherine Parr was pleasant-looking and well-dressed, and clearly took care with her appearance, but she was not spectacular. She was not the kind of woman who stopped conversation when she entered it. What she was, and what mattered more than anything else at this point in Henry's life, was capable. She was a woman who had managed 2 previous households with efficiency and grace, who had developed genuine intellectual interests including humanist scholarship and Protestant theology, who had read widely and thought seriously about what she read, and who was perceptive enough to understand from the available evidence exactly what surviving as Henry VIII's wife required. It required, in short, constant and careful navigation of a personality that had grown less predictable and more dangerous with each passing year. Before Henry's attention settled on her, Catherine had been quietly developing what looked as though it might become a relationship with Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Jane Seymour, and a man whose personal charm was considerable and whose judgment, as subsequent events would demonstrate, was considerably less so. Seymour was attractive, energetic, and the kind of man who fills a room in ways that have nothing to do with titles or formal power. Catherine seems to have been genuinely drawn to him, and he to her, and under different circumstances the thing that was developing between them might have developed into something real and lasting. Then Henry noticed Catherine Parr, and the circumstances changed immediately and completely. When a king who had executed 2 of his previous wives made his intentions clear to a woman at his court, that woman had very little practical choice in the matter, regardless of her own preferences. Catherine accepted him. She later wrote that her own will had been set aside and that she had come to believe the marriage was the will of God, which is perhaps the most diplomatically phrased description of marrying under royal compulsion anywhere in the historical record. It is also a sentence that repays careful reading, because it tells you 2 things simultaneously. It tells you that Catherine understood perfectly well that her own preferences had not been the deciding factor, and it tells you that she had found a way of framing the situation that allowed her to proceed with her dignity and her sense of herself intact. These were not small achievements in the circumstances. What Catherine Parr brought to the marriage, in practical terms, was thoroughgoing competence across every dimension that mattered. She managed the royal household with an efficiency that was both genuine and visible. The household under her stewardship functioned well, which sounds unremarkable until you consider that it was an enormous and complicated institution, full of competing interests, and that its master was a man whose temper was uncertain, and whose expectations were high, and whose previous wives had not all found the management of it straightforward. She also acted as regent when Henry went on campaign in France in 1544, becoming the 3rd of his wives to hold that role. Catherine of Aragon had been regent in 1513 when the Scots invaded, and Flodden was fought. Anne Boleyn had governed in Henry's absence during one of his earlier excursions. Now Catherine Parr joined that list, managing the council and the administration and the correspondence of a kingdom at war with a composure that earned genuine respect from the councillors she worked alongside. This is a somewhat underappreciated fact about the women Henry married. Whatever else might be said about his approach to matrimony, he repeatedly chose women capable of governing in his absence, which suggests either that he had better judgment in some areas than his overall record implies, or that the Tudor court simply produced women of formidable administrative ability, possibly through the mechanism of making the alternative to competence extremely unappealing. She also maintained good relationships with all 3 of Henry's children, which was itself a diplomatic achievement of some complexity. Mary, Elizabeth and Edward were a group of individuals who had navigated genuinely difficult childhoods. who had complicated feelings about each other and about their father, and about the succession of women who had occupied their mother's place, and who did not all find each other easy company. Catherine managed them with warmth and attentiveness. Elizabeth, in particular, seems to have been genuinely fond of her, not in a performed courtly way, but in the way of a young person who has found an adult who takes her seriously and treats her intelligence as an asset rather than an inconvenience. Catherine appears to have taken a real interest in Elizabeth's education, encouraging her studies and engaging with her intellectually in ways that left a mark on the young princess that lasted well beyond Henry's reign. Catherine was also, and this is worth emphasising, a writer. She published 2 works during Henry's lifetime, Psalms or Prayers in 1545 and The Lamentation of a Sinner, which appeared shortly after Henry's death but had been written during his reign. The Lamentation is a confession of Protestant faith of considerable directness, a document in which Catherine describes her own spiritual journey away from what she calls the blindness of Catholic practice toward a reformed understanding of Scripture and salvation. It is not a hedged or cautious document. It says what it means. That she wrote it at all under Henry's government, in an era when Protestant theology could and regularly did result in capital charges, suggests either considerable courage or considerable confidence in her ability to manage the king, or both simultaneously. Both seem likely in a woman of her demonstrated character. She came very close to destruction in 1546, in an episode that illuminates both the continuing dangers of Henry's court in its final years and the particular quality of intelligence that Catherine brought to surviving it. Henry, by this point in deteriorating health and growing increasingly suspicious of everyone around him, with the undiscriminating anxiety of a man who has spent decades having good reason to be suspicious and can no longer easily distinguish the genuine threats from the imagined ones, apparently allowed or encouraged a conservative faction led by Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, to investigate Catherine for heresy. The investigation was real. A warrant was reportedly drawn up for her arrest. The mechanism that had destroyed others was in motion. How Catherine discovered the warrant is not entirely clear from the sources. What is clear is that she found out, and that she moved with the kind of decisive speed that suggests she had been mentally rehearsing exactly this scenario for some time. She went to Henry directly. She made her position clear. She told him, with a precision that was itself a masterclass in managing a particular kind of vanity, that she had discussed religious matters with him not in order to instruct him, but in order to benefit from the superior quality of his own learning, to be corrected by his wisdom and guided by his understanding. Henry, who had been told his entire life that he was the most intelligent person in any room, and who had never entirely stopped believing it, was mollified almost immediately. He called her his sweetheart. He reportedly told the council members who arrived the following day to arrest her that they were knaves and fools, apparently having entirely forgotten or set aside the fact that the investigation they were pursuing had been conducted with his knowledge and possibly at his instigation. Catherine stood beside him as he said this. She had survived by giving him what he needed most, which was the reassurance that he was the one in control, that he was the learned one, that he was the generous one for giving an overzealous counsel, that the power in the room was entirely his. This episode is worth dwelling on at some length, because it illustrates with unusual clarity what it actually took to survive Henry VIII. It was not enough to be innocent. It was not enough to be loyal. It was not even enough to be intelligent in the abstract sense. What it required was a very particular kind of emotional intelligence, the ability to read precisely what Henry needed from a specific moment and to provide it before he had quite finished deciding that what he needed was someone's destruction. It required the capacity to subordinate your own pride completely in service of his, to make him feel capable and authoritative in exactly the moment when he was being most arbitrary and most dangerous. Catherine had that ability in full measure and had apparently developed it consciously rather than stumbling into it. She outlived him, which was itself an achievement of a kind that requires no qualification. Henry died in January 1547. Catherine, freed at last from the daily work of managing a dying king, moved relatively quickly toward the life she had apparently been waiting for. She married Thomas Seymour, the man she had been interested in before Henry's attention had intervened, within months of Henry's death, a speed that some contemporaries found unseemly, but which is perhaps understandable in a woman who had spent several years setting her own preferences aside. The marriage was not, as it turned out, the uncomplicated happiness she might have hoped for. Seymour proved to be reckless, politically overambitious, and considerably more interested in his own advancement than in the well-being of the woman he had married. Catherine died in September 1548 of puerperal fever, shortly after giving birth to their daughter. She was 36 years old. She had survived Henry VIII, managed his household, governed his kingdom in his absence, helped raise his children, published her own Protestant theology under his nose, and talked her way out of an arrest warrant by flattering him at precisely the right moment. That she then died in childbirth in a marriage she chose freely, with a man who was not worthy of her, is the kind of ending that history occasionally produces with a bluntness that resists any easy interpretation. She survived Henry VIII. That is not a small thing. For two of the women who had stood where she stood, it had proved impossible. The tyrant in full, Henry's court, his power, and his paranoia. There is a version of Henry VIII that focuses primarily on the personal, the marriages and the wives and the theological arguments. But there is another dimension of his reign that is equally important, which is the systematic way in which he exercised power over the people around him, and what that exercise of power did to the culture of his court and his country. Henry VIII was not a tyrant in the way that a figure like Ivan the Terrible of Russia was a tyrant, not erratic and personally violent in the immediate physical sense. He did not personally torture people or lose his composure in public. He maintained, even in his most destructive moments, a surface of royal dignity that was itself a kind of performance. But the effect of his power on those around him was genuinely tyrannical in the deep sense, in the sense that no one was safe, that loyalty was no protection, that friendship offered no guarantees, and that the king's goodwill was the only currency that mattered, and it could be withdrawn without warning. The list of people who rose to the heights of royal favour under Henry VIII and then fell catastrophically is extraordinary. Wolsey, the greatest minister in England, died disgraced and broken. Thomas More, Henry's friend and admired intellect, was executed. Thomas Cromwell, who had reordered the English state, went to the scaffold. Thomas Culpeper, a court favourite, executed. 3 of Henry's 6 wives died during or immediately following his reign, 2 of them by execution. The Earl of Surrey, the finest poet in England in the 1540s, was executed in the last weeks of Henry's reign. The Duke of Buckingham was executed in 1521. Margaret Pole, the elderly Countess of Salisbury, who was in her 70s and had known Henry since his childhood, was executed in 1541 in what even contemporaries described as a particularly horrifying manner. What this created was a court culture of extraordinary tension. People learned to watch the king carefully for signs of shifting mood. They learned to say what they thought he wanted to hear, which was often not the same as what they actually thought. They learned that proximity to power was both the most valuable and the most dangerous position available, that being in the inner circle meant being in the place where the king's eye could fall on you when it was searching for someone to blame. Henry's paranoia intensified as his reign progressed. In his later years, particularly after the Pilgrimage of Grace and the continued religious tensions of the 1540s, he seems to have become genuinely suspicious of almost everyone around him. He was surrounded by factions, and he knew it. The conservative faction, led by Norfolk and Gardiner, and the reformist faction, associated with Cranmer and the Seymour family, circled each other constantly. Henry used this competition deliberately, allowing each side to undercut the other and drawing benefit from their rivalry, while remaining the only fixed point that either side needed to please. This was sophisticated political management, but it was also exhausting and ultimately corrosive of any genuine trust. The treason laws, expanded significantly during Henry's reign, made the expression of certain opinions a capital offence. It was treason to deny the royal supremacy. It was treason, under the Statute of 1534, to speak or write words that maliciously impugned the king's right to the throne. The word maliciously was doing considerable work in that sentence, and in practice the boundary between protected opinion and treasonous statement was uncertain enough to make open discussion of sensitive matters hazardous for anyone with enemies or limited protection. The court poet Thomas Wyatt, who had been a friend of Anne Boleyn and was briefly imprisoned in the Tower at the time of her fall, survived partly through luck and partly through the powerful friends he retained. His sonnets, some of the finest in the English language, are marked by an awareness of the arbitrary nature of royal favour that was clearly based on personal experience. Who is in, who is out, who has the king's ear this morning and the king's displeasure by evening? These were not abstract themes for Wyatt. They were the texture of his daily life. Henry's relationship with Parliament during his reign is also worth noting. He did not govern against Parliament in the manner of later absolutist monarchs. He was actually rather good at managing Parliament, at understanding its rhythms and its concerns, and at presenting his policies in ways that Parliament could approve. The great constitutional changes of his reign, the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the succession acts all went through Parliament. Henry seems to have understood that parliamentary authorization gave his actions a legitimacy that mere royal decree would not have conveyed. But this was collaboration, not delegation. Parliament under Henry VIII was not an independent check on royal power. It was an instrument of royal policy. Members who opposed the king's wishes found themselves in danger. The Speaker of the Commons had to navigate the king's preferences. The Lords Spiritual, the bishops and abbots who sat in the House of Lords, were bodies whose independence had been systematically reduced through the religious changes of the 1530s and 40s. Parliament served Henry's purposes because Henry made sure it would, and because everyone involved understood what happened to people who did not cooperate. The culture of Henry's court also had genuinely positive aspects, something that is easy to overlook in the catalogue of executions and political violence. It was a court that genuinely valued learning and music and wit. Henry's circle included some of the finest minds in England. The King's Book, the theological statement issued in 1543, reflected Henry's own genuine engagement with the theological debates of his era. The Royal Chapel produced music of extraordinary quality. The court's enthusiasm for humanist scholarship had nourished a generation of educated nobles and gentlemen scholars. Henry himself was genuinely an impressive and interesting man, not merely a monster in a padded doublet. But the tragedy of his character, if tragedy is the right word, is that his genuine gifts were deployed in a system that gave his worst impulses no effective check. A man with Henry's intelligence and his vanity and his psychological need to be right, placed in a position of absolute power that was reinforced by every institution and individual around him, was a man whose judgment would inevitably become distorted. By the last decade of his reign, the feedback mechanisms that might have corrected his errors, trusted advisors willing to say no, a wife capable of holding his attention, an opposition capable of visible persistence, had all been destroyed or driven away. He ruled more completely alone, in the sense of without genuine accountability, as time went on, and the consequences were visible in his decisions. War, Scotland, and the obsession with legacy. Henry VIII fought wars throughout his reign, with varying degrees of success and consistent degrees of expense. His relationship with warfare was partly a genuine strategic concern about England's position in the European balance of power, and partly a deeply personal desire to prove himself the kind of king that military glory required. The two were not always easy to separate. His early wars with France in the 1510s had been relatively successful in morale if modest in material achievement. The Battle of the Spurs in 1513, the Siege of Tournai. These were not the great conquests of an Edward III or a Henry V, whose shadows lay heavily over every English king's military ambitions, but they were real enough to sustain Henry's image as a martial king, which was important to him. The great obsession of his foreign policy was France. England had historical claims to French territory that went back to the 100 Years' War, claims that had been progressively reduced until only Calais remained as an English possession on the continent. Henry was not going to recover Normandy or Anjou or any of the other territories that had once been under English control, and at some level he probably knew this. But the symbolic importance of the French engagement, of being taken seriously by the great continental powers, of having military campaigns to point to, never diminished. The Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520 was one of the most spectacular diplomatic events of the century. A meeting between Henry and Francis I of France, staged with a magnificence that was itself the message, a demonstration that England was a power worth impressing, and that its king was a monarch who could compete in the arena of Renaissance display with the most powerful rulers of the age. The preparations alone took months. The event lasted nearly 3 weeks. Both sides spent enormous sums. A temporary palace was constructed. There were jousts and banquets and theatrical performances. Henry and Francis apparently arm-wrestled at one point. Nothing politically significant resulted from any of it. Henry and Francis were at war with each other again within 2 years. The Field of the Cloth of Gold was, in retrospect, an extraordinarily expensive way to demonstrate that two kings could be charming to each other for a fortnight. Henry's wars in the 1540s were more costly and less glorious. The invasion of France in 1544 was Henry's last military campaign in person. He was 53, struggling with his leg, travelling much of the way in a specially constructed chair, and apparently still insisting on being visibly present in ways that required his attendance to manage the logistics of moving a very large and increasingly immobile king around a military encampment. Boulogne was captured, which pleased him. The campaign as a whole was enormously expensive and produced gains that were subsequently largely traded away in the peace negotiations that followed. Scotland was a persistent concern throughout the reign, not merely an occasional irritation, but a structural problem. The traditional Scottish-French alliance meant that England faced potential pressure from both north and south whenever it was in conflict with France. The defeat of the Scots at Flodden in 1513 had been a major victory, but it had not resolved the underlying situation, and relations between England and Scotland were intermittently hostile throughout Henry's reign. In the 1540s, Henry pursued a policy towards Scotland that historians have called the rough wooing, an approach of extraordinary practical stupidity and tactical creativity simultaneously. The plan was to force a marriage between the infant Mary Queen of Scots, who had been born in 1542 after the death of her father James V, and Henry's son Edward, thereby uniting England and Scotland under Tudor succession. The method of persuasion chosen was military raids into Scotland, burning towns and villages and crops, which was based on the theory that the Scots could be intimidated into compliance. The Scots responded to being burned by becoming more hostile to England and more firmly attached to France. Scotland sent Mary to France, where she eventually married the French Dauphin. The rough wooing was a comprehensive failure that achieved the opposite of its intended goal, and it cost considerable resources to achieve this failure. This is, in diplomatic history, something of an achievement. Henry's obsession with legacy extended beyond warfare. He invested heavily in the physical fabric of his reign, in palaces and residences that would embody his kingship in stone and brick and glass. He built and rebuilt and expanded on a scale that was genuinely remarkable. Hampton Court was enlarged dramatically. Nonsuch Palace, begun in 1538, was designed to be the most magnificent palace in England, its name literally meaning none such, no other like it. He maintained over 60 residences during his reign, a portfolio that reflects both enormous wealth and a restless need to mark his presence on the landscape. The portraits matter too, and particularly the great Holbein portrait of 1537, in which Henry stands in his famous wide-stance posture, legs apart, hands at his sides, facing the viewer directly with an expression of absolute authority. This was not an accidental pose. It was a carefully constructed image designed to communicate specific things about what Henry VIII was and what he expected the world to understand about him. Broad, powerful, direct, immovable. The portrait became the definitive image of Tudor kingship, the visual shorthand for royal authority, and it was done by design. He also understood the power of the historical record. He kept chroniclers. He managed propaganda through the printing press, which was new enough in England to be a genuinely powerful tool. He controlled what could be printed and what could not. He shaped the narrative of his own reign with the same attention he brought to shaping the law, which is to say, comprehensively and with a firm sense of the outcome he desired. The legacy he was trying to construct was one of greatness, of a king who had expanded royal power, reformed the church, built magnificent palaces, won wars, and above all secured the succession. The last element was the most important and the most personal. Everything else was backdrop. The whole point, the obsession at the centre of it all, was the son, the heir, the continuation of the Tudor line. Edward, born in 1537, was the justification for everything. The body of the king, health, weight, and decline. To understand the Henry VIII of the final decade of his reign, it helps to understand what was happening to his body, because the physical transformation of Henry VIII is one of the most dramatic personal histories in the life of any monarch, and it had profound consequences not just for his quality of life, but for his political behaviour, his emotional state, and the experience of everyone around him. The young Henry of 1509, the Golden Prince of the early reign, was by all accounts physically magnificent. Tall, athletic, with the kind of body that spent several hours a day on horseback and in the tilt yard. He was genuinely fit in the way that people who do serious physical exercise every day are fit, not merely decoratively, but functionally powerful. He remained physically active through most of the 1520s and into the 1530s, though increasing weight was becoming visible. The dietary habits of a Tudor court were not designed with longevity in mind. Feasts were enormous and frequent. Meat was consumed in quantities that would make a modern nutritionist weep. The concept of vegetables as a significant part of the diet had not quite reached the royal table in the form we might recognise. Henry ate enthusiastically and at scale. Then, in 1536, the year of Anne Boleyn's execution and Jane Seymour's rise, Henry had a jousting accident. He was unhorsed during a tournament at Greenwich and lay unconscious for 2 hours. The accident appears to have caused significant head injury, and some historians have argued that personality changes visible in Henry after this point may have been neurological consequences of the trauma. The argument is not without merit, though it is also not the only explanation for the increasing severity and unpredictability of his behaviour in the late 1530s and 1540s. The jousting accident also contributed to or coincided with the deterioration of a wound on his leg that had been present in some form for years and now became chronic and debilitating. The exact nature of the wound is debated. It may have been a varicose ulcer, or a wound from an earlier jousting accident that had never properly healed, or possibly both. Whatever its origin, by the late 1530s it was causing him serious pain. The ulcer on his leg became one of the defining conditions of his later life, periodically closing and reopening, generating intense pain when closed, and a deeply unpleasant discharge when open, making physical activity increasingly difficult and contributing significantly to his expanding waistline. By the 1540s, the transformation was complete and visible. Henry at 50 was almost unrecognisable as the figure of the 1510 portrait. He was enormously obese, his waist measurement recorded in the armoury records as approximately 54 inches. He had to be moved around the palace by mechanical conveyance, a specially constructed device that allowed him to be transported between rooms. He needed help getting up and down stairs. Simple physical movements had become significant undertakings. The weight itself was not just uncomfortable, it had consequences for almost every aspect of his health. Sleep apnea was probably present. His legs were swollen and painful. He suffered from what appeared to have been gout and possibly type 2 diabetes. The leg ulcer remained a constant torture. He was in chronic pain during much of the last decade of his reign. What this meant for his behaviour is something that requires careful handling. It is too simple to explain Henry's political cruelties as merely the product of physical suffering. He was perfectly capable of ruthlessness when he was young and healthy, but it is also probably true that a man in chronic pain, physically constrained and increasingly immobile, who had always derived enormous satisfaction from physical activity and the competitive arena of the tournament and the hunt, was a man who was losing the things he valued most about himself. And that loss, in a person of Henry's psychological constitution, was likely to produce anger and the displacement of that anger onto available targets. He also became increasingly isolated. As he became less mobile, the tight social world of court that had always been his natural habitat contracted. The constant movement between palaces, the hunting expeditions, the tournaments, these had been the occasions of genuine social interaction, of the competitive male camaraderie that Henry had loved. As they became impossible, he was left in rooms, with attendants who were there professionally, with advisors who were managing him, and with a succession of wives of varying ability to maintain his interest. His temper in the last decade is consistently described by contemporaries as unpredictable and frightening. His physicians walked carefully around him. His advisors chose their words with precision. His wives learned to manage him rather than to engage with him on equal terms. The court around him was a court of watchers and managers and careful performers, not the electric, intellectually engaged gathering of his early years. He suffered from headaches. He suffered from insomnia. He suffered from what sounds very much like depression, though the Tudor vocabulary for this would have been different. He ate more, which made the physical situation worse, which probably made the emotional situation worse, in the kind of self-reinforcing cycle that is very familiar and very human, and very difficult to interrupt. He was not, by the last years of his reign, a well man in any dimension of the word. He was a man in considerable suffering, exercising enormous power over others while losing power over himself, and using his authority in ways that grew less and less tethered to any consistent principle beyond the satisfaction of his own immediate needs and the suppression of his own anxieties. The portrait at the end was very different from the portrait at the beginning. Same man, technically. But the distance between them was measured in more than years. The last years and the death of Henry VIII. The final years of Henry VIII's reign were years of gathering twilight. The man who had remade the English church, dissolved the monasteries, executed queens and ministers and bishops and poets, who had bent Parliament and the papacy and the nobility to his will, was now a figure in evident decline, holding the reins of power with hands that were increasingly stiff and uncertain. The court that surrounded him in these final years was a quieter, more watchful place than the blazing, music-filled world of his youth. People moved carefully around him. They spoke carefully around him. They had been doing both for a long time, but by the mid-1540s the care had become something closer to management, and everyone involved knew it, even if no one said so. The religious settlement remained genuinely unresolved, which is a remarkable thing to say about a reign that had begun 20 years earlier with the specific goal of resolving it. The 6 Articles of 1539 had attempted to enforce doctrinal conservatism, stipulating traditional Catholic positions on transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, and related matters, and attaching serious penalties to those who deviated from them. The reformers around Cranmer found themselves in a genuinely uncomfortable position, close enough to the centre of power to be influential, but unable to push the theological settlement in the Protestant direction they wanted, without risking a king who was entirely capable of burning people who pushed too hard. The Conservatives around Gardiner and Norfolk, meanwhile, wanted to roll back even the changes that had already been made, to restore as much of the old order as could be salvaged from the institutional wreckage of the previous decade. Henry sat in the middle of this conflict, pulled in both directions, making decisions that sometimes pleased the reformers and sometimes pleased the Conservatives, and often pleased neither for very long. He had always been the pivot point of English religion, the man whose personal theological preferences determined what the country believed that particular year, and in the last years of his reign that position was unchanged. What had changed was the quality of his judgment and the consistency of his attention. A man in chronic pain, sleeping badly, moving with difficulty, surrounded by factions that were already jockeying for position in the reign that would follow his, was a man whose grip on the fine details of policy was inevitably loosening. He went to war with France in 1544, capturing Boulogne but at an enormous financial cost that his treasury was poorly equipped to absorb. The war required the debasement of the English currency, the mixing of base metals into the silver coinage to stretch the available supply, a decision that was financially understandable in the immediate term and deeply damaging to ordinary English people's purchasing power in the years that followed. Food prices rose, wages lagged behind them. The economic consequences of Henry's final military adventure fell, as economic consequences almost invariably do, on people who had no voice in the decision that created them. Farmers and tradespeople and urban workers absorbed the cost of a war that had been fought to satisfy a king's aging need to prove that he was still the monarch who had stood at the gates of Terouanne, that the warrior of 1513 was still somewhere inside the enormous pain-racked body of 1544. The domestic front was no calmer. The last full year of his reign, 1546, saw a final convulsion of factional struggle at court that was partly a genuine contest for power and partly a positioning exercise for the regency that everyone knew was coming. The Conservative faction, led by Gardiner and Norfolk, appeared for a time to be gaining the upper hand, their influence with the king seemingly increasing as the reformist grouping around Cranmer and the Seymour family struggled to maintain their position. Then the tide turned again, sharply and finally against them. Gardiner was excluded from the council at a crucial moment, the precise circumstances of which remain debated by historians, but which resulted in his effective removal from the inner circle of power. Norfolk and his son, the Earl of Surrey, were arrested on charges of treason in December 1546. Surrey, who was not merely a nobleman but one of the finest poets in the English language, a man whose sonnets had helped to establish the form in English literature, was executed in January 1547. Norfolk himself was saved only because Henry died before the execution warrant could be carried out, which is the kind of survival that must produce a complicated mixture of gratitude and horror in equal measure. What caused the final shift against the Conservatives is not entirely clear, and the ambiguity is instructive. Thomas Cranmer's influence clearly played a role, as did that of the Seymour family, particularly Edward Seymour, who would become Lord Protector for the young Edward VI. The timing of events suggests that the reformist faction was positioning itself deliberately for the transition of power, ensuring that the Regency Council that would govern during the minority of a 9-year-old king would be populated with people of their persuasion rather than their opponents. Henry by this point may have been too unwell to fully understand what was happening around him in all its dimensions, or he may have understood it clearly and approved the direction, finding in the reformers around Cranmer a safer stewardship for his son's minority than the Conservative nobility whose power had periodically threatened his own. or he may have been managed by the people closest to him in ways that his earlier self would have detected and resisted, and that his later self simply could not. We cannot know with certainty. The man who had made an art form of playing factions against each other may, at the very end, have been played himself. Henry VIII died in the early hours of the morning on the 28th of January 1547 at Whitehall Palace. He was 55 years old. He had been king for 37 years and 9 months. His death had been expected for some weeks by those closest to him, though the expectation was not one that could be spoken aloud without considerable personal risk. His physician is said to have been genuinely afraid to tell him he was dying, because suggesting to Henry VIII that he was mortal was not a conversation that a man in his position could easily survive. The idea that even his doctors had to manage the most fundamental truth available to them tells you something about the world that had formed around this king over the course of nearly 4 decades. The death was announced to the court with some delay. The councillors who would form the regency government for the young Edward VI spent the hours immediately following Henry's death ensuring that their own positions were secure and their arrangements in order before the news was made public. The machinery of succession, which Henry had worked so hard to construct through Acts of Parliament and royal wills, and the systematic destruction of alternatives, now operated without him, smoothly enough, though the smoothness concealed the frantic activity that produced it. The body of the king lay at Whitehall for several days, while the elaborate logistics of a royal funeral were organised. He was buried at Windsor, in St George's Chapel, beside Jane Seymour, as he had apparently wished. The woman who had given him his longed-for son, who had died 12 days after that son's birth, who had never had the opportunity to disappoint him, or be discarded or outgrow her usefulness, remained in death as she had been in his memory, the wife he returned to. The vault also contains the coffin of Charles I, though that arrival was some 90 years later, and entirely unforeseen by anyone present at Henry's burial, which is one of those small historical coincidences that feel too neat to be accidental, but apparently are. Contemporary reactions to his death were varied, and in some cases carefully performed. There was grief, genuine in some quarters, among those who had loved him or been genuinely served by him, or who simply mourned the passing of the only monarch most of them had ever known. There was relief, quietly felt by people who had spent years navigating the particular anxiety of his presence, who had watched friends and colleagues, and occasionally family members disappear into the tower and emerge changed or not emerge at all. There was uncertainty about what came next, about whether the religious direction that the reformers intended for the young king's reign would hold, about who would really govern England while the king was a child, about whether the settlement that Henry had spent so long constructing would survive the test of succession. Henry died as he'd lived, surrounded by people who were managing him and each other simultaneously, whose feelings about him were layered with decades of fear and service and occasional genuine affection, and who were already necessarily thinking about the future he would not be part of. His will left the throne first to Edward, then to Mary, then to Elizabeth, reinstating his daughters to the succession even as they remained technically illegitimate under earlier acts. It was the characteristic Henry move, bold, comprehensive, legally creative, and leaving behind exactly the kind of ambiguity that would keep lawyers and councillors and eventually the whole country occupied for the next generation. The man was gone. The country he had made was not going back to what it had been before him, and the consequences of his reign, in religion and politics and the long argument about what England was and what it owed to whom, were only beginning to become fully visible. The legacy of Henry VIII. What he left behind when Henry VIII died in 1547, he left behind a country that was in almost every significant way different from the country he had inherited in 1509. The changes he had made were not all of his own devising, and he had not always understood the full consequences of what he was setting in motion. But the world of 1547 was his world in a way that the world of 1509 had been his father's. The most obvious and lasting change was institutional. The Church of England existed. Whatever its subsequent theological development under Edward, Mary and Elizabeth, the structure that Henry had created in the 1530s and 40s, a national church with the crown at its head, not subject to Roman jurisdiction, organised through an archbishop and a system of bishops and parishes, proved remarkably durable. It adapted, evolved, survived the Protestant radicalism of Edward's reign, and the Catholic restoration of Mary's reign, and the Elizabethan settlement, and it remains the established Church of England today. Its architecture, its liturgical calendar, its role in English public life, these carry traces of the Henrician settlement in their foundations. The monasteries were gone. This was not reversible. The land had been sold. The buildings had been stripped. The communities had dispersed. The libraries had been scattered. England in 1547 was already a country whose physical and economic landscape had been permanently altered by the dissolution, and the men who had bought former monastic land had no intention of giving it back. Mary I, who came to the throne in 1553 and restored Catholicism, was unable to reverse the dissolution because the political and economic consequences of trying to do so were simply too large. The monasteries were not rebuilt. The land stayed where it was. The royal supremacy changed the relationship between the crown and the church permanently. Even after the Elizabethan settlement created a church that was more genuinely Protestant than Henry had intended, the principle that the crown held ultimate authority over the church's institutional arrangements was retained. The Church of England remained a church of the state in a way that the pre-Reformation English church had not been, and that relationship shaped both institutions for centuries. The legal and administrative machinery that Henry's reign, particularly Cromwell's administrative revolution, had built was also durable. The reorganisation of the Royal Council, the development of a more systematic approach to royal administration, the use of Parliament to authorise fundamental constitutional change, these all left their marks on how England was governed. The succession was a more complicated legacy. Henry had worked desperately to secure the Tudor dynasty through a male heir, and he had succeeded. But he had also created, through the circumstances of his various marriages, a set of successors whose legitimacy was all contested to varying degrees. Edward was the undisputed heir, but he was 9 years old and in uncertain health. Mary, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, was technically illegitimate under the terms of the Act of Succession, even as Henry's will designated her a successor. Elizabeth, his daughter by Anne Boleyn, was in a similar position. The legal architecture of the succession was a tangle of acts and wills and legitimacy questions that the next 20 years of English history would do their best to resolve. Edward VI became king at 9 and died at 15 in 1553, having presided over a radical Protestant reformation of the English Church under the guidance of his uncle Edward Seymour and later the Duke of Northumberland. His church was genuinely Protestant in a way Henry's had not been, introducing a new prayer book, removing images from churches, and stripping away the remaining Catholic liturgical elements. Mary I followed him, restoring Catholicism and the papal connection with a determination that her father's treatment of her mother had, if anything, strengthened. She burned Protestants. She is remembered, not entirely fairly, primarily for those burnings. She died in 1558 without an heir, and the throne passed to Elizabeth. Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, ruled England for 45 years and created a settlement that was Protestant in theology, Catholic in its organisational structure, and English in its identity in a way that managed to hold together a country that had been pulled in violently different directions for 3 decades. Her settlement was not quite what any of the competing factions had wanted, which may be why it worked. Henry VIII's personal legacy on his children is also worth noting, because it is complicated and not always flattering. He was absent from their lives in important ways and present in dangerous ways. Mary he ignored and treated contemptuously for the years when Catherine of Aragon's refusal to accept the annulment made her an inconvenience, only to restore her to favour when it suited him. Elizabeth he treated with similar ambivalence. Edward he genuinely prized but barely knew. The longed-for son who arrived when Henry was nearly 50, and who was kept carefully distant from the kind of robust physical environment Henry himself had loved. The psychological marks left on his children by his approach to them are visible in subsequent history. Mary's fierce Catholicism was partly the faith of her mother, maintained as an act of loyalty to Catherine's memory. Elizabeth's careful emotional distance from commitment, her lifelong unmarried state, her preference for managing relationships rather than fully entering them, these are patterns that a psychiatrist examining her childhood might find comprehensible. The image of Henry VIII survived him in ways he would probably have found satisfying. He became very quickly the defining image of English kingship, the model against which other monarchs were measured. His portraits, particularly the Great Holbein image, became the visual shorthand for royal authority, for English self-confidence, for a kind of blunt and assertive power that the English have alternately celebrated and been embarrassed by in the centuries since. He was celebrated in Protestant England as the king who broke from Rome, the liberator of the English Church from papal tyranny. He was condemned in Catholic writing as a tyrant who executed saints and destroyed centuries of religious culture for personal convenience. Both characterizations captured something real, and neither captured everything. The full picture is, as always, considerably more complicated. He was a man of genuine intellectual gifts and genuine cruelty, of real cultural ambition and real psychological limitations, of enormous historical consequence and deeply personal moral failure. He remade his country and destroyed many of the people closest to him in the process, and he convinced himself throughout that he was right, that God was with him, that history would vindicate him, that the people he executed had deserved it, and the women he discarded had failed him. Whether history has vindicated him depends on what you think history is for. England after Henry VIII was different from England before him. The church was different, the state was different, the very idea of what England was in relation to the rest of the world was different. These changes had consequences that ran for centuries, some of them profoundly good, and some of them profoundly bad, and most of them impossible to assess cleanly on any simple scale. He left behind, in the end, the thing that mattered most to him: a dynasty. Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, 3 monarchs in a row, all Tudor, all his children. The dynasty outlasted him by 66 years. The last Tudor, Elizabeth I, died in 1603, leaving no children. The throne passed to the Scottish Stuarts. The Tudors ended. But the England they had made, and above all the England that Henry VIII had made, the Church of England, the royal supremacy, the parliamentary monarchy, the peculiar English capacity for reforming its institutions while insisting that it is merely restoring ancient traditions, these things endured in one form or another far beyond the dynasty itself. Henry VIII was a man who wanted to be remembered. He spent his reign making sure that he would be. He succeeded, though perhaps not always in the ways he intended. He wanted to be remembered as a great king, a righteous ruler, a reformer guided by conscience and learning and divine mandate. He is remembered instead as the man with 6 wives and a beard, the king who broke a church for reasons that mix the personal and the political and the theological in proportions that historians still argue about, the monarch who executed his oldest friend and 2 of his wives and died enormous and in pain in a palace that smelled of the ulcer on his leg. He's remembered, in other words, as himself, complex, contradictory, impossible to reduce to a simple verdict, which may be the most human thing about him, and that perhaps is the most honest thing to say about legacy. The complicated ones last the longest, because they give us something to keep arguing about. As the story of Henry VIII comes to its end, the weight of it can settle slowly, the way history always does when you let it rest. The court is quiet now. The bonfires that burned for the birth of his son are long extinguished. The wives are at peace in ways they rarely were in life. The great portraits still hang in their galleries, still presenting that famous confrontational gaze, still asking you to meet his eyes and decide what you think. But you do not have to decide tonight. The story has been told. The piece is laid out. You can let the voices of those long corridors fade gradually, the sound of lutes and the distant roar of tournaments, the hushed conversations of courtiers choosing their words with care. What you have heard tonight is one of history's most extraordinary stories, not because it is unique in its violence or its ambition, because history offers plenty of both, but because it happened in a way that changed the long thread of an entire civilization's religious and political identity, and because at its centre was a man who was, for all his power and all his cruelty, recognizably human in his vanity and his need, and his extraordinary capacity for convincing himself that whatever he wanted was what he deserved. Let that settle now. Let the galleries go dark. Let the portraits face the empty rooms. Let the story become what all stories eventually become, the past, which is the quietest place there is. Sleep well.